Hello and welcome to the Gwen Dress sewing pattern video tutorial sew along. Look at all these beautiful examples from my testers. This pattern has been tested across all of my sizes, 0 to 23, so 24 sizes. One important thing I want to mention again, I know I said it in the instructions, but if your chest to bust difference is greater than 2 inches, definitely do a full bust adjustment. You are gonna love the fit of your bodice much more if you make the proper adjustments for your body. And follow the link in the instructions. That is a super straightforward full bust adjustment video tutorial that I love and I've had great success with. And after that, let's just jump right in with making a ton of bias tape. Okay, let's get started with making some bias tape. I'm going to fold my fabric right sides together. I'm going to bring that selvage side up to that cut edge side. And I'm just going to line it all up evenly. My magnets are going to help hold it in place. And then cut that excess off so I can get a perfect square here. And then I'm going to cut along that fold. So I'm cutting my square directly in half. I'm going to have 2 triangles that are now right sides together. And then I'm going to take that left side and rotate it 90 degrees, put it back right sides together, and match up my edges here. And we're just going to go straight across and then press that seam allowance open. So once you have that sewn and pressed open, it's going to look like this. And then this is me flipping it to the right side. So I have the right side facing up right now, and I'm lining up what is now a bias edge of my fabric with the straight lines on my cutting mat. And then I'm drawing lines 1.5 inches apart. And this is because that's the size of the bias tape we're going to be using. I am going to do this to the very bottom of my piece of fabric here and then trim off the little tiny discrepancy I have at the end. And then you're going to see that my line color changed and my shirt changed, but that is because I forgot to film one portion of that. So I refilmed it or redid it. And so what I'm doing here is lining up my first line with that bottom edge of my fabric. So you saw me fold it right sides together, and you're just going to be offsetting those lines by 1. That's what's going to make this a continuous loop. Then you're going to sew that straight across, press the seam open, and you'll have this like tube of fabric that is honestly kind of wonky. But you'll see on that seam, our lines are now connected. You can see we have a little tab at the top and a little tab at the bottom, and you're just gonna cut with your scissors along that line, and it's gonna continuously go around, and it's gonna feel like forever, but it's really cool to see it sped up like this. At the end, you're gonna have this long strip of bias tape. You're gonna fold the edges in towards the wrong side, and then fold that in half once more, and that'll be your double fold bias tape. That's my edges folded in once, and here I am folding it in twice for, again, double fold bias tape. Here I have all my pieces cut out. That's the side back, the side front, the mid front, the center front, mid front, side back, and center back. And then there's my peplum because I'm making view C pockets, and then my skirt pieces right here. I'm using the same fabric for my lining, and all of those pieces are cut out and underneath what you're seeing here. And the first step is to fold that center front and center back piece wrong sides together along that fold line. So you just fold them in half, press that down good, and that's step 1. And then what I'm going to do with my center back piece is take a closer look at those notches, and I'm just going to connect that line all the way across my center back piece so that I will have an easier time sewing across that stitching line. So I'm just going to line up my straight edge, connect the notches from either side, and draw a straight line across. And repeat that until I reach the very bottom of my center back piece. And you can see right here the faint little lines. That's just going to make it so much easier to sew these lines across. This is air-soluble ink. I also use water-soluble ink. You can use anything that's just going to come off. And then with wrong sides still together, we are going to sew across all of those lines, and the ones that are a little bit more narrow or closer together are going to be our elastic channels. So the next step is to cut your elastic pieces, and I have elastic length recommendations on step 4. Depending on your size, I have different lengths recommended. Then I'm going to use a safety pin, hook up one side of my elastic, and start threading it through one of the narrow channels. And when my elastic gets to the end there, I'm going to stitch it down within the seam allowance just to hold it in place. Then I'm going to shimmy that safety pin and elastic all the way over to the other side and do the same thing. Stitch that elastic down within the seam allowance so that it stays in place and doesn't snap to the middle. And then you're going to repeat that for the rest of your elastic channels all the way to the bottom of the center back piece. Then moving on, we are going to take our middle front and place it right sides together with our side front and match that notch, and then sew that seam with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Make sure it's all lined up. I want to note here again that my lining is the same as my main fabric, and so I hope that doesn't get confusing. I'm going to press that seam open, and then I'm going to repeat that for the other side as well as both sides of my lining fabric, which again is the same fabric. Once those are all sewn up, we're going to take our side back piece and place it right sides together with our side front piece. We're going to match up that side seam and sew straight down, pressing the seam allowance open, and then of course repeat that for the other side as well as the lining pieces. So here I have those 3 pieces sewn together with the seam allowance pressed open, and then I'm going to place the straps right sides together and sew that shoulder seam with the same seam allowance, and of course press the seam open and repeat this for the other side as well as all of the lining pieces. So there it is, sewn together and pressed open. And now I'm going to take one lining piece and one main fabric piece and place them wrong sides together. I'm going to match up the side seam, the front bodice seam, all of the edges, and I'm just going to be stitching around this whole bodice piece along the edge within the seam allowance just to hold it in place really well. And I'm going to repeat this for the other side, but I do want to note this can look a little tricky right here because my main fabric and my lining fabric are the same. I just want to make sure that you double check you are putting your lining fabric wrong sides together with your main fabric, and also make sure you have 2 mirrored sides. So when your main fabric is facing out, you should have a left side and a right side. And I'm just going to pin around this whole thing, like I said, stitch it very close to the edge just to hold it all in place nice and neatly. And do repeat it for the other side, but again, make sure that you do have 2 mirrored pieces when you do this step. You don't want 2 left sides, basically, is what I'm trying to emphasize that we avoid. Once you have both sides complete, we are going to grab our center front piece, and we are going to make sure the folded side of that center front piece is facing up towards the straps. And we are placing that center front piece on the lining side. So like I said, my lining fabric and main fabric is the same. Just pretend my lining side is clearly up, not my main side. Again, place the center front on the lining side. Pretend this is clearly my lining side. And we're going to just sew straight down. And we're going to repeat this for the other side. So I'm going to put the center front piece face down on my lining side. And so on the right side of this video right here, that is my main fabric facing up. What my center front piece is matching up with right now is the lining side of the other side of my bodice. I know this sounds a little bit backwards, but we want that raw edge that we're creating to be on the main fabric side. So we're going to sew this in place, and then this is our main side. And what looks all nice and neat is our lining side. And I know that sounds weird, but trust me. So we're going to have lining side facing up. We're going to grab the center back piece and kind of shimmy the fabric. You can get it to like scrunch more in the middle rather than the side, and it makes this step a little easier to sew. We are putting that center back piece onto the lining side. Sew that down and do the same thing. Right here is my lining side up, and I'm shimmying that elastic again, and I'm going to put my center back piece face down onto my lining side of my bodice. On the other side, again, this sounds so wrong and backwards, but it is correct. That raw edge, we want to be on the main side, the outside, the right side of the bodice, because we are going to bias bind it. So we're going to grab our bias tape now and unfold one side so you can put the right side of your bias tape to the center front piece, and as you move along the center front piece, when you get to that scooped neckline area, your bias tape is going to be right side to the lining side, and it will be right side to the lining side all the way up and around the strap. And then when you get to the center back piece, you're going to be right side of your bias tape to your center back piece. And then you are going to stitch this down in the fold of your bias tape. And just to kind of get another little visual here, the right side of the bias tape is to the center back, and then as you move up, it is to the lining side of the strap, and then in the front, it is to the center front piece. See right there is where it kind of gets a little tricky. But we're going to repeat this for the other side, and then we're going to want to trim down that seam allowance. And that's just going to make folding our bias tape around the raw edge a bit easier. You can see in there is the lining, and then the outside, what I have on the outside right now is the main fabric. And then I'm just going to take my scissors, trim up that seam allowance. Like I said, we want to get the seam allowance pretty small. This is 3/4 inch bias tape, so we want that seam allowance pretty small to be able to wrap it around nice and neatly, and then close up that raw edge, basically around the front, over the straps, and to the center back for both sides. And here is what it'll look like when you have that bias tape completely sewn and the raw edge is enclosed. It looks like this beautiful red ribbon that is just going around the style lines of my bodice. And here is the back view. Again, this is right side or main fabric facing up, facing out. And it's tricky because the inside looks what the outside would usually look like. Now we are going to create our loops, and in step 13 of the instructions, you can find how long of a piece of bias tape you'll need and how many loops. Basically, you're going to sew that bias tape shut at close to that folded edge, and then cut 2-inch sections for your loops. And then I fold mine together and place them underneath that already sewn bias edge, and just tuck the raw edge right in there because we are going to sew that bias tape down onto the center back and the center front. So that is how the raw edge of these loops get closed up. In this, I am just lining the loops up on each piece of elastic that I have along the back, and then I'm just evenly aligning them in the front. I kind of shimmy them around. And this is where the raw edge of the loops are. They are right along that stitching line there. And then this is how I kind of make sure that the loops are even on either side of the center front. I just fold them together and make sure they kind of line up. And then we are going to fold that bias tape down onto the center front like that and onto the center back. I'm going to sew that bias tape down onto the center front and down onto the center back. And I like to back stitch at each loop. And I cut this part short because my head just blocked the whole entire thing. But here is how it looks finished. That bias tape is sewn down onto the center front and back stitch at each loop, and the back is done in the same exact way. And now for view B and C, we're going to grab our sleeve. And for view C, we are going to draw a line that connects the 2 notches towards the bottom of the sleeve. That is going to be where we sew down the bias tape for our elastic channel that creates the little sleeve ruffle. So I'm going to grab my double fold bias tape, open it up just once, and place it face down onto the wrong side of my sleeve and sew it down with the center of the bias tape matching up with that line that we drew connecting the 2 notches. Sew it close to the edges on both sides of the bias tape, and then you're going to measure your elastic around your wrist. The sleeve should end about 1 inch above your wrist. I like to have my elastic fitted a little higher up on my arm. That way I can push my sleeves up and have a little bit more volume, or they can hang down low comfortably and not hug too tight on my wrist. And I'm going to cut 2 of those elastic lengths, use a safety pin again, and thread it through my bias tape channel, similar to how we did on the center back piece. And when the elastic gets towards the end of the end of the elastic, when I'm threading it through, I'm going to sew it down inside of the seam allowance so that it does not pull through to the center of our elastic channel. And just like we did on the center back piece, and then I'm going to shimmy the rest of the way across. And once I get to the other side, I'm going to stitch that elastic down once again on the other side of the sleeve. And I know it is tempting, but if you don't stretch the sleeve like that, the gathers will stay towards the center, and it's much easier to sew the sleeve than right sides together for the underarm seam. But next I am going to sew 2 basting stitches in between the gathering notches. So I took notches. The pattern piece has a squiggly line across the sleeve cap. I just put notches on either side, and then you pull the bobbin threads and shimmy those gathers together. I think I did not film the part where I sew the sleeve right sides together and then finish the seam, but assume that I did. And then you are going to place your bodice right side facing out and your sleeve wrong side facing out. And you're going to pin your sleeve wrong side to your bodice lining side. And match up the side seam to the underarm seam, match your notches, and then adjust your gathers as needed. And then sew your sleeve to your bodice armhole. Again, wrong side of the sleeve to lining side of the bodice. And that sounds wrong, it feels wrong, but trust the process. So then we are going to grab our bias tape, and I like to start at the side seam, underarm seam, fold that end of my bias tape in towards the wrong side. And then if you are doing view A, this is just going to be right side of bias tape to the lining side of your bodice. But for view B and C, this is right side of the bias tape to the right side of your sleeve. And I'm going to pin that all the way around. And then sew just past that folded beginning edge of my bias tape. And that will then, when I flip the bias tape over, we'll have a finished edge or, a neat junction. And then I'm going to trim that seam allowance and then fold the bias tape over the raw edge and stitch it down like so, close to the folded edge of the bias tape. And this is what it'll look like. The sleeve raw edge that faces the right side is now completely bound with beautiful red bias tape. And there you can see I had sewn my sleeve and finished the seam. I then like to press that bias tape towards the sleeve. The bias tape that just bound the seam allowance, the raw edge, sleeve to bodice, I press that towards the sleeve. It just lays nice that way. And now we're going to set this beautiful bodice aside for a moment. This is our skirt front and back. The back has the 2 notches, the front does not. We're going to grab our pockets, place them right sides together for the front and the back. Pockets right sides together, match the edge of the pocket to the top edge of the skirt and along the side of the skirt. Sew those all in place, press the seam allowance towards the pocket, then lay them right sides together, match along the pocket and along the side seam, sew it together and finish the edge. And then we're going to do those basting stitches again from the notch to the side seam for the back piece and then across the entire front of the skirt. Now we're going to pull those bobbin threads to gather up our skirt. We're going to match the front of the skirt from pocket to pocket or side seam to side seam to the front of the bodice, side seam to side seam. And then the back we are going to gather from the notch to the side seam and match that from the side seam of the bodice to the center back. So across the side back piece. The elastic section on the center back is what goes in between the 2 notches. So then I am going to place my pockets. I'm going to fold them over to the front of the skirt. I'm going to pin them in place. Mine overlap a little bit in the center front. That's totally okay. If yours has a little gap, that is also totally okay. And I'm just going to sew them down over the gathers to hold them in place. Now with my skirt right side out and my bodice wrong side out, I'm going to place my bodice into my skirt and I'm going to match wrong side or lining side of my bodice to the wrong side of my skirt. That is going to sound confusing. You have wrong sides together. I'm going to match up the side seams, any of the notches that I have, the center fronts together, all of that, but you are going to have the lining side of your bodice facing the wrong side of your skirt. In other words, the wrong side of your bodice to the wrong side of your skirt. Wrong sides together, because we want that raw edge that we are going to create right here to be on the right side for when we bias bind it and have that beautiful exposed red bias tape on this one. You are going to need to stretch the center back bodice when you sew in between the two notches, and it should fit just perfectly. And there's my raw edge on the right side of my dress. I'm going to keep that bodice tucked in for right now while I set this aside for a moment and do view C, where I grab this peplum, this waist peplum, and I'm going to have right side of my bias tape to the wrong side of the peplum and just bias bind that edge all the way around, sew it down in the fold of the bias tape, and then fold it over that raw edge and stitch down the bias tape to conceal the raw edge of your peplum. Sew that down, and then we are going to match it up with our skirt. So like I said, leave the bodice inside of the skirt. The skirt is right side facing out, and I'm going to match the front bias bound edge of my peplum to the side part of the center front piece that has the bias binding and the loops. I'm going to match up that binding with the peplum binding. There are notches on this peplum, and that you're going to line up with the side back, center back seam, because you need to, again, stretch that center back bodice piece while you sew this peplum on. Wrong side of the peplum is facing the right side of the skirt. And you're just going to sew this on over the stitching line we previously did. Here it is. And then we are going to put our bias tape on. Again, I'm going to fold that beginning like little 3/8 inch in so that I have a finished edge when I get all the way around to the other side. And I am putting the right side of my bias tape to the bodice side. And then I'm going to trim that seam allowance, especially if you're doing view C. It is very, very important here to trim this seam allowance. It can get a little bulky, so you want to make sure you trim it well. That way you can wrap your bias tape over this raw edge nice and neatly and stitch it down like I'm showing here. Wrap the bias tape over so close to that folded edge of your bias tape to then conceal that raw edge nice and beautifully. And now we can pull that bodice out and just take a quick look-see at her. She's coming together and looking so beautiful with all of this exposed bias tape detail. I like to press that waist seam bias tape up towards the bodice. I find that it just lays nicely that way. And let's just admire her for a second. We're going to set her aside and start piecing together our ruffle. We are going to place right sides together and sew across that shorter edge, and then finish the seam. If you had to cut more than 2 pieces for your front and back ruffle, that's totally okay. Just piece them together and form a big ruffle circle before doing your basting stitches. Then we're going to pull the bobbin threads and gather up our bottom ruffle, and we're going to place the wrong side of the ruffle to the wrong side of the skirt. So if you have your dress right side facing out and your ruffle wrong side facing out, you can tuck that ruffle into the skirt and they will have wrong sides together. We're going to sew it down, and then we are going to grab our bias tape, and I'm going to put my bias tape to the skirt side. So I'm going to unfold one edge of my bias tape, fold in the wrong side, and place that right side of my bias tape to the right side of my skirt, so all the way around in the fold. And then, of course, trim the seam allowance all the way around the skirt. Again, trimming that seam allowance is super important because we are using 3/4 inch bias tape, and it just makes it so much easier to fold that little bias tape around a much smaller seam allowance. So I'm going to fold it over the raw edge and stitch it down close to the folded edge of the bias tape for this beautiful red ribbon-like exposed bias tape seam for my ruffle. I like to press that seam or the bias tape up towards the skirt, towards the top of the dress. And then we're on to our last few steps. I'm going to fold up the hem, the bottom side of that ruffle to the wrong side by 1/2 inch all the way around that ruffle. It's going to feel like miles long. And then I'm going to fold up one more time, 1/2 inch again to enclose that raw edge. And then for the sleeve, I'm going to do the same exact thing, fold up 1/2 inch and 1/2 inch again, and sew that down for the hem of my sleeve on view C. If you are doing view B, leave a little gap when you sew this hem to insert your elastic, and you can measure your elastic the same way we did for view C earlier in this video. Slide your elastic in, sew your ends together, and then close the gap you left to insert your elastic. Now we are on to the ties. I had just a little bit of bias tape left, so I sewed it all shut, and luckily it was just enough for the center front lace-up section of this dress, but I did have to go back and make some more bias tape for the back section, the back lace-up section of this dress. But anyway, I just lace it up all the way and then tie a little knot at the end of my bias tape. And that does just fine with that raw edge there, tying a little knot. What I like to make sure of is when I lace this up, I want to extend this center front, for example, as far as it goes, as wide as it goes, and make sure the tie does not come through that top loop. You want to make sure you have enough tie to where it's not going to be unthreading itself or getting back through the loop, and then you have to rethread it every time you want to take it on and off if it's fully extended. So just make sure you have enough bias tape or ribbon or whatever you're using for that, and I'm going to show on the back how I do that. So I'm just going to stretch my back piece and like pretend that I'm threading it up just to make sure I have enough length for when that elastic back is stretched up all the way. And I just zigzag across one and then double it so that I get the other side of the zigzag. And I added a little extra just to be sure, since this isn't the most exact method. But then I just sew right along the edge of the bias tape, lace it all up, and there you have it. You can certainly trim as needed. If you stretch that back all the way and you have a lot of extra tie, you can just trim it, just as long as when it's fully stretched, you are not losing your tie through the loops. Yeah, and there we have it, our completed Gwen dress. Isn't she lovely? Isn't she so beautiful and elegant? And we just love her, every little detail and every little adjustable, beautiful feature that she has. Thank you for watching. I'm so excited to see yours. As always, if you need any additional help, fitting tips, anything of the sort, construction help, all of that, just send me a message, either on email or on Etsy or on Instagram even, and I am so happy to help. If you do share on social media, please tag me so I can see. I want to say use the hashtag, but who knows what Instagram is doing with hashtags these days. But the hashtag is Gwen Dress Pattern. So yeah, please share. I want to see. Thanks for following along. I'll see you next time.